Welcome to my channel, The World of Science Fiction. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel.
The crimson sand beneath Marcus's boots crunched with each labored step as he approached the obsidian fortress that rose from the desert like a monument to darkness itself. The twin moons hung overhead, casting an eerie silver glow across the wasteland he had traversed for 7 grueling days. His water had run out 2 days ago, his rations 3. Only sheer determination and something he couldn't quite name, a pull, a calling, had kept him moving forward through the scorching days and freezing nights. The massive gates loomed before him, carved from black stone and inlaid with symbols that seemed to writhe in the moonlight. As he approached, they groaned open without his touch, revealing a corridor that stretched into the bowels of the fortress. The air that rushed out carried the scent of burning oil, exotic spices, and something else, something ancient and dangerous. Marcus stepped inside, his hand instinctively moving to the plasma rifle slung across his back. The weapon felt inadequate against whatever lay ahead, but it was all he had. The corridor was lit by torches that burned with an unnatural blue-green flame, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Strange hieroglyphs covered every surface, telling stories of conquest and dominion in a language that predated human civilization. The sound of his footsteps echoed endlessly as he walked deeper into the fortress. Guards appeared from alcoves, tall, imposing figures clad in armor that looked like it had been forged from the very darkness itself. Their faces were hidden behind helmets shaped like snarling beasts, and they carried weapons that hummed with energy. They flanked him, but made no move to stop his progress. They simply watched, their presence a constant reminder that he was walking into the heart of enemy territory. The corridor opened into a vast throne room that took Marcus's breath away. The ceiling soared so high it disappeared into shadow, supported by massive pillars carved to resemble twisted trees. The floor was polished obsidian that reflected the flames of 100 torches, creating the illusion that he was walking on a lake of fire. The air was thick with the smell of burning incense and the metallic tang of spilled blood. At the far end of the hall sat the alien king upon a throne, carved from a single massive crystal that pulsed with an inner light. He was enormous, easily 8 feet tall, with skin like burnished copper and eyes that glowed like molten gold. His face was angular and predatory, with high cheekbones and a mouthful of teeth designed for tearing flesh. A crown of black metal adorned his head, set with gems that captured and reflected the torchlight like trapped stars. Warriors lined the walls, their armor a patchwork of different metals and technologies, spoils of conquest from 100 different worlds. Some wore the sleek environmental suits of space marines, others the scaled armor of desert nomads. All bore weapons that spoke of violence and death, and all watched Marcus with the hungry attention of predators sizing up potential prey. Marcus forced himself to walk forward, each step an act of will. The king's presence was overwhelming, a crushing weight that seemed to press down on his soul. But he had come too far to turn back now. 7 days through the desert, months of preparation before that, years of searching for this place. All for a reason he still didn't fully understand. He stopped before the throne and met the king's burning gaze. For a long moment the hall was silent, except for the crackling of flames and the distant sound of wind howling through the fortress's upper reaches. The king leaned forward, his voice a deep rumble that seemed to emanate from the very stones of the floor. "You crossed the desert alive. Impressive." His accent was strange, the words coming out with an odd cadence that spoke of a tongue not originally designed for human speech. "Most who attempt the crossing die within the first day. The sun bleaches their bones white before the night hunters have a chance to feast." Marcus said nothing, waiting. He had learned long ago that sometimes silence spoke louder than words. The king smiled, revealing those predatory teeth. "Name your reward, human." "Gold?" He gestured to a corner where chests overflowed with coins and precious stones. "Weapons?" Another gestured toward racks of alien armaments that hummed with barely contained energy. "Freedom?" The word dripped with contempt, as if the concept itself was foreign to him. Marcus's eyes should have been drawn to the treasures, to the promise of wealth and power beyond imagination. Instead, they drifted past the king, scanning the shadows at the edges of the hall. Something was pulling at his attention, a sensation like a half-remembered dream tugging at the corners of his consciousness. And then he saw her. In a shadowed alcove to the left of the throne, barely visible in the dancing torchlight, sat a figure chained to the wall. The chains were massive things, forged from a metal that gleamed dully in the firelight, and they held her in a position that spoke of both punishment and display. She was clearly not human. Her skin had a faint blue tint that became more pronounced in the shadows, and her hair was silver white, falling across her face like a curtain of starlight. Despite the iron collar that bit into her neck and the chains that bound her wrists and ankles, she maintained a regal posture. Her back was straight, her head held high. There was something about her bearing that spoke of nobility, of someone who had once commanded respect and fear in equal measure. Marcus found himself unable to look away. She was beautiful in an alien way that transcended species, with delicate features that somehow managed to convey both fragility and strength. But it was more than that. Looking at her, he felt a strange stirring in his chest, a sense of recognition that made no logical sense. The hall grew quiet as Marcus raised his hand and pointed directly at her. "I want her." The reaction was immediate and electric. Gasps rippled through the assembled warriors like a wave. Weapons were shifted, armor clinked as bodies tensed. The very air seemed to crackle with tension. The king's smile faded, replaced by an expression of genuine surprise. In all his centuries of rule, no one had ever made such a request. Prisoners had begged for gold, for weapons, for their freedom. None had ever pointed to the chained woman and demanded her as their prize. "No one has dared to unchain her for 200 years, the king said slowly, his voice carrying a note of warning. "Do you know what you ask?" Marcus didn't answer immediately. He couldn't explain the pull he felt, the certainty that this was why he had crossed the desert, why he had risked everything to reach this place. All he knew was that he needed her to be free, needed it with a desperation that bordered on madness. "I know what I want," he said finally. The chained woman's head lifted at the sound of his voice. For the first time since he had entered the hall, she looked directly at him. Her eyes were amber, like liquid gold, and they held depths that spoke of centuries of pain and waiting. When their gazes met, Marcus felt something shift inside his chest, as if a piece of a puzzle he hadn't known was incomplete had suddenly clicked into place. Her lips parted, and in a voice unused for centuries, rusty with disuse but still melodious, she whispered, "You came back." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. He staggered back a step, his mind reeling. He had never seen her before in his life. He was certain of it. Her face, her voice, everything about her was completely foreign to him. And yet, "What did you just say?" The words came out as barely more than a whisper. Chains rattled as she leaned forward as far as her bonds would allow. The movement caused the iron collar to dig deeper into her neck, drawing a thin line of blue-tinted blood, but she didn't seem to notice the pain. 2 centuries I waited, she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. 2 centuries in darkness, counting the passage of time by the changing of the guards, by the rise and fall of civilizations beyond these walls. 2 centuries I waited for you to return and finish what you promised. Marcus's heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. "I don't understand. I've never been here before. I've never seen you before." But even as he spoke the words, doubt crept into his voice. There was something about her, something that stirred memories that weren't quite memories, sensations that felt like echoes of another life. The king slammed his spear into the floor with a sound like thunder. The massive weapon, carved from what looked like the backbone of some enormous creature and tipped with a blade that shimmered with its own inner light, left a crack in the obsidian. "Enough!" His voice boomed through the hall, silencing the murmurs that had begun to spread among the warriors. "I will not have my throne room turned into a theater for the delusions of a chained sorceress and a mad human." But Marcus barely heard him. He was lost in those amber eyes, drowning in a flood of emotions he couldn't name or understand. The woman continued to stare at him with an intensity that seemed to pierce through to his very soul. "You don't remember," she said softly. "I can see it in your eyes. But I remember you. I remember the way you held me as the citadel burned around us. I remember your promise that you would come back for me, that not even death would keep us apart." "Stop," Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. Images were flashing through his mind. glimpses of scenes that felt both foreign and familiar. A burning tower silhouetted against a blood-red sky, the sound of screaming and the clash of weapons. And through it all, the desperate need to protect someone, to save someone who meant everything to him. The king rose from his throne, his massive form casting a shadow that seemed to swallow half the hall. "She is not a prize," he said, his voice deadly quiet. "She is a curse. Do you know what she is, human? Do you know what she has done?" Marcus forced himself to look away from the woman long enough to meet the king's blazing gaze. "Then curse me too." The words hung in the air like a challenge. The court erupted in murmurs, warriors tightening their grips on weapons. Some laughed, harsh sounds that spoke of battles fought and won. Others watched with the calculating gaze of predators sensing opportunity. The king studied Marcus for a long, dangerous silence. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "Very well," he said slowly. "If you can survive the trial of the Unchained, she is yours. But know this, human, the trial is not meant to test your worthiness. It is meant to kill you." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine, but he didn't allow it to show on his face. What does the trial involve?" The king's smile returned, but now it was cold and predatory. "At dawn, you will face her in the arena. She will be released from her chains, but the chains themselves will remain attached to her wrists. They become her weapons, and she becomes your executioner." The woman made a sound, something between a gasp and a sob. "No," she whispered. "I won't. I can't." "You can and you will," the king cut her off. "Or you will both die in ways that make the trial seem merciful." Marcus looked back at her, seeing the anguish in her eyes. Whatever connection existed between them, whatever history they might have shared, she clearly didn't want to hurt him. But he could also see the resignation there, the knowledge that they were both trapped in a game with rules they couldn't change. "I accept," Marcus said. The king nodded, as if he had expected nothing less. "Guards, take him to the holding cells. Let him rest and prepare for his death." As the armored figures moved to escort him away, Marcus caught one last glimpse of the chained woman. She was watching him with an expression he couldn't read, a mixture of hope and despair that cut through him like a blade. "What's your name?" he called out as the guards began to drag him away. For a moment, he thought she wouldn't answer. Then so softly he almost missed it over the sound of clanking armor and marching feet, she spoke. "Lyra." The name echoed in his mind as they led him through the dark corridors to a cell deep in the bowels of the fortress. Lyra. It felt familiar on his tongue, like a word he had spoken 1,000 times before. The cell was a simple stone chamber with a small window that looked out onto the arena where he would face her at dawn. Marcus sat on the rough cot and stared out at the circular space, trying to prepare himself for what was to come. But his mind kept drifting back to those amber eyes and the impossible certainty in her voice when she had said he had come back. The sound of movement from the adjacent cell broke his reverie. A voice, raspy and tired, drifted through the stone wall. "You're not the first, you know." Marcus turned toward the wall. There was a small grate near the floor, barely large enough to pass a tray through. In the darkness beyond, he could make out the faint outline of a figure. "What did you say?" A dry laugh echoed from the neighboring cell. "You're not the first who came for her. You're just the one who made it to the arena." Marcus moved closer to the grate. "Who are you?" "Someone who's been here longer than I care to remember. Someone who's watched this game played out before." The voice was bitter, tinged with a pain that spoke of years of captivity. "Tell me, human, what did she say to you? Did she call you by name? Did she claim to remember you from some past life?" A chill ran down Marcus's spine. "How do you know that?" "Because I've heard it all before. 3 years ago, it was a Zilonian warrior. Before that, a merchant prince from the Outer Rim. Each one convinced he was special, convinced he was the one she'd been waiting for." Marcus's mouth went dry. "What happened to them?" "They died in the arena, of course, but not before she convinced them to break her chains, not before she made them believe they were saving her." The voice dropped to a whisper. "Tell me something. When you look at her, do you feel like you know her? Like you've loved her before?" "Yes," Marcus admitted reluctantly. "That's her gift. She reads your mind, your deepest desires, your hidden memories. She becomes whatever you need her to be. A lost love, a forgotten promise, a destiny you never knew you had. Marcus felt the world shifting beneath his feet. You're lying. Am I? Think about it. How convenient that you, a nobody from nowhere, just happened to cross an impassable desert to find the one person in the galaxy who claims to know you. How convenient that your greatest desire is to save a chained princess. Before Marcus could respond, something metallic clattered against the grate. A dented water cup rolled across the floor, thrown from the adjacent cell with enough force to dent the stone. All who spoke those words to me, came a new voice, female, melodious despite the harsh circumstances, later begged to die quickly. Marcus's blood froze. It was Lyra. She had been listening. The sound of chains rattling filled the silence as she moved closer to her own grate. In the dim light, Marcus could see her amber eyes gleaming through the metal bars, much closer than he had expected. Her fingers wrapped around the iron bars, knuckles white with pressure. "Did you come here to die?" she asked, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than a shout. "Or do you actually think I'll say thank you?" Marcus could smell her scent through the stone and metal, exotic, alien, with an undertone of something wild and dangerous. She was close enough that if the bars weren't there, she could have touched his face. "Will you be the first to die slowly?" Her voice carried a promise of violence that made the air itself seem to thicken. The questions hammered at Marcus's consciousness, each one raising doubts he hadn't allowed himself to consider. But even as the stranger's words and Lyra's threat sank in, something deeper rebelled against them. Marcus picked up the dented cup and without a word placed it gently back through the grate toward her cell. The simple action spoke louder than any declaration of intent. A long silence followed. When the voice from the other cell spoke again, it carried a note of something that might have been respect. You know, the others never did that. They talked back, made promises, tried to convince her they were different. None of them ever just accepted her challenge quietly. "Even if that's true," Marcus said slowly, "even if she's manipulating me, I still have to try." "Why? Because you think you love her? Because she's in chains?" A long silence followed. When the voice spoke again, it carried a note of something that might have been respect. "You know, the others never said that. They talked about destiny, about cosmic connections, about completing their grand purpose. None of them ever said they just wanted to free someone from chains." Hours passed in contemplative silence. The alien constellations wheeled overhead, following patterns that were as foreign to him as everything else on this world. But as he watched them, fragments of memory began to surface. Not full memories, but impressions. Emotional echoes that felt more real than anything else in his life. A woman's laughter, bright and musical. The feeling of holding someone close while the world burned around them. A voice, his own voice, making a promise that not even death would break. Just before dawn, guards came for him, but not to lead him to the arena. Instead, they escorted him through corridors he hadn't seen before, deeper into the fortress where the air was thick with incense and the whisper of old magic. They stopped before a chamber whose walls were made entirely of crystal. Inside, barely visible through the translucent barrier, sat Lyra. She was no longer chained to the wall, but heavy shackles still bound her wrists and ankles. "A final courtesy," one of the guards said in heavily accented standard. "The condemned may speak to each other before the trial." Marcus stepped closer to the crystal wall. Lyra looked up at him, and he saw something in her amber eyes that he hadn't noticed before. A flicker of uncertainty, almost of fear. "You came," she said, her voice muffled by the barrier between them. "I said I would." She stood slowly, the chains dragging against the stone floor. "Marcus, listen to me. In the arena, I won't be able to control what happens. The chains, they have a will of their own. They feed on violence, on blood. Then I'll be careful." "No." Her voice was sharp, urgent. "You don't understand." She moved closer to the crystal, her breath fogging the surface between them. "You'll be the first I kill, and I don't want to." Marcus pressed his palm against the crystal wall. The barrier was thin enough that he could feel the warmth of her hand on the other side, almost touching. "Then you won't kill me," he said simply. A long pause stretched between them. Lyra's hand moved as if to trace the outline of his neck through the crystal, her fingers following the line where the collar would soon rest. But at the last moment, she jerked her hand back. her eyes wide with something that might have been horror. "I want you to know," Marcus said quietly, "I don't hold anything against you. Whatever happens in there." Lyra's expression hardened. "What if you scream?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it cut through the crystal like a blade. "What if you beg me to stop?" "I won't be able to. I won't stop." Marcus met her amber gaze steadily. A heartbeat passed, then another. "Then you won't stop." The simple acceptance of his fate seemed to hit her harder than any protest would have. Her breath caught, and for a moment, the predator's mask slipped, revealing something vulnerable and broken underneath. "Those memories, they might not be real," she whispered, her voice breaking. "The chains, the king's sorcery, they can create false histories, implant feelings that never existed. Are you saying you don't know me?" "I'm saying I don't know if what I feel is real, or if it's just another layer of the king's curse." Tears began to flow down her cheeks. "I'm saying that in a few hours, I might try to kill the only person who's shown me kindness in 2 centuries, and I won't be able to stop myself." The crystal between them began to cloud over, the magic that allowed their meeting coming to an end. "Lyra," Marcus called out as her image faded. "Real or not, I'm going to free you." Her final words reached him just as the crystal went opaque. "I hope you can forgive me for what I'm about to do." By the time the first pale light of dawn began to creep across the sky, Marcus had accepted that whatever was happening to him was beyond his understanding. The stranger's warnings, Lyra's fears, his own fragmented memories, all of it swirled together in a storm of doubt and determination. All he could do was trust in the strange certainty that had brought him across the desert, and hope that when the time came, he would know what to do. The guards came for him as the sun crested the horizon. They led him through corridors filled with spectators, beings from dozens of different worlds who had come to witness the trial. Some were clearly natives of this world, with the same copper skin and golden eyes as the king. Others were obviously off-worlders, pale humanoids with elongated limbs, insectoid creatures with compound eyes, even what looked like sentient plants that rustled and whispered as he passed. The arena was a circular pit carved from the same black stone as the rest of the fortress. Tiered seating rose up on all sides, already filled with eager spectators. The king sat in a box that overlooked the arena floor, his crystal throne transported for the occasion. The morning sun cast harsh shadows across the sand-covered floor, and Marcus could smell blood in the air. Old blood from countless previous battles. At the center of the arena stood Lyra. The chains that had held her to the wall now hung from her wrists like metallic serpents. Each chain was easily 20 feet long and forged from the same dull metal as her collar. She had been given a simple tunic that left her arms and legs free to move, and her silver hair had been pulled back to keep it out of her face. She was beautiful and terrible to behold, like a warrior goddess preparing for battle. But when she looked at Marcus as he was led into the arena, he saw the pain in her amber eyes. "You don't remember me," she said as they were left alone in the center of the arena. "But I remember you, human. I remember everything." The crowd roared its approval as Marcus drew his plasma rifle and checked the charge. It was a pitiful weapon compared to the living weapons that were attached to her wrists, but it was all he had. "Tell me," he said as they began to circle each other. "Tell me what I'm supposed to remember." Lyra raised her hands and the chains responded like living things, coiling and uncoiling with fluid grace. "Your name was different then. Your face was different, but your soul is the same." She struck without warning, one chain whipping toward him with enough force to shatter stone. Marcus threw himself to the side, rolling in the sand as the chain left a crater where he had been standing. The crowd erupted in cheers and jeers. "We were lovers," Lyra continued, as if they were having a casual conversation instead of fighting for their lives. Another chain strike, this one aimed at his legs. Marcus leaped over it and fired his rifle, the plasma bolt searing past her shoulder. "We were lovers and we were rebels. The Citadel was our stronghold, our sanctuary. We thought we were safe there." Marcus found himself being driven back toward the wall as she advanced, the chains creating a web of death around her. Each strike was precise, controlled. She was fighting to subdue him, not to kill him, though the distinction seemed academic given the power behind each blow. "What happened to the Citadel?" he asked, genuinely curious, despite the fact that he was fighting for his life. Pain flashed across her features. "Betrayal. One of our own sold us to the king's forces. They came in the night, overwhelming our defenses. The citadel burned, and everyone inside died. Everyone except us. A chain wrapped around his rifle, yanking it from his hands with such force that his shoulders screamed in protest. The weapon clattered across the arena floor, coming to rest against the far wall. Now he was defenseless except for the combat knife at his belt. "You fought like a demon that night," Lyra said, advancing on him with slow, deliberate steps, cutting through the king's soldiers like they were nothing, but there were too many of them. In the end, they brought you down with sheer numbers. But something was changing in her voice, in her movements. The controlled precision was giving way to something more primal, more dangerous. Her amber eyes began to glow with an inner fire, and the chains around her wrists started to move with a life of their own, writhing like serpents sensing prey. "Lyra," Marcus said, backing away as she advanced. "Something's wrong. Fight it." She shook her head, but the motion was jerky, unnatural. "I told you," she gasped between clenched teeth. "I told you I couldn't control them." The chains lashed out with renewed fury, no longer under her conscious direction. Marcus barely avoided a strike that would have taken his head off, the metal passing so close to his face that he could feel the displaced air. "The blood," Lyra managed to say, her voice distorting as the trance took hold. "They smell blood. They want more." Marcus looked down and realized his hands were bleeding from where he had grabbed the chains earlier. The scent was driving the cursed metal into a feeding frenzy. Lyra's movements became fluid, inhuman. She danced around him with impossible grace, the chains flowing around her like liquid death. Each strike came closer than the last, and Marcus could see in her glowing eyes that she was losing the battle for control. "I can't stop," she whispered, even as one chain wrapped around his ankle and sent him crashing to the sand. "Marcus, I can't stop." He rolled away just as the other chain smashed into the ground where his head had been. Sand and stone exploded upward, raining down on both of them. "Then don't," Marcus said suddenly, surprising himself with the words. Lyra hesitated, the chains freezing mid-strike. "What?" "Don't stop. If this is what it takes, if this is the only way, then finish it." The arena fell silent. Even the bloodthirsty crowd seemed shocked by his words. "I won't let you sacrifice yourself for me again," Lyra said, tears streaming down her face even as the chains continued to writhe around her. "Again?" Marcus asked. The memory hit them both at the same moment, a shared vision that blazed across their minds with the force of revelation. The citadel's main gate was burning, enemy soldiers pouring through the breach like a dark tide. They were outnumbered 10-1, the situation hopeless. But the escape tunnel wasn't finished yet. They needed more time. "Take this," he said, pressing his sword into her hands. The blade was ancient, forged with the same metal that now formed her chains. "The passage leads to the desert. You can make it." "Not without you," she protested. "Yes, without me. Someone has to hold them here, buy you time to get away. It has to be me." She knew he was right, but the knowledge felt like a sword through her heart. "I won't leave you to die alone." "You're not leaving me. You're giving my death meaning." He kissed her then, fierce and desperate. "Promise me you'll survive. Promise me you'll live." "I promise," she whispered, "but you have to promise me something too. Anything. Promise me you'll find a way back to me, even if it takes forever, even if you have to tear through the barriers between life and death. Promise me you'll come back." "I promise," he said, and sealed the vow with blood drawn by the ancient blade. The vision faded, leaving them both gasping in the arena sand. The chains had gone completely still, and Lyra's eyes had returned to their normal amber. "You kept both promises," she said softly. "You held them long enough for me to escape, and you found a way back to me." Marcus struggled to his feet, his mind reeling from the recovered memory. "But if you escaped, how did you end up here? How did you become the king's prisoner?" Lyra's expression darkened. "I came back for your body. I couldn't leave you there, couldn't let them desecrate what remained. But the king was waiting. He knew I would return, knew I couldn't abandon you. He took me prisoner and bound me with chains forged from your sword, the blade that held our blood oath." The pieces fell into place with horrible clarity. The chains weren't just cursed metal. They were forged from the weapon that had sealed their vow, binding her not just physically, but spiritually to their shared promise. "That's why you recognize me," Marcus said. "That's why the chains react to my blood. And that's why they have to be broken by you, Lyra replied. Only the one who made the original oath can sever the bonds. Marcus could see it in his mind's eye. Flashes of memory that felt more real than the present moment. The clash of blade against armor, the smell of smoke and burning flesh, the desperate certainty that he had to protect her no matter the cost. I thought you were dead, Lyra continued. I watched them drag your body away, watched your blood pool on the stones. I thought I had lost you forever. Her chains lashed out again, but this time Marcus was ready. Instead of dodging, he stepped into the attack, grabbing one of the chains with both hands. The metal was warm to the touch, almost alive, and he could feel a strange energy pulsing through it. But you promised me, Lyra said, tears now streaming down her cheeks even as she fought to control the chain he had grabbed. Even as you lay dying, you promised me that you would come back, that not even death would keep us apart. The memory hit him like a physical blow, suddenly completely overwhelming in its intensity. He was lying on cold stone, his life bleeding out through a dozen wounds. She was kneeling beside him, her hands trying desperately to stop the bleeding, and he was speaking, making a promise with his last breath, swearing an oath that transcended mortality itself. I remember, he whispered. The words seemed to hit Lyra harder than any physical blow. She staggered back, the chains going slack in her hands. You remember? I remember dying, Marcus said, his voice growing stronger. I remember the promise. I remember loving you more than life itself. The arena had gone silent. Even the bloodthirsty crowd seemed to sense that something extraordinary was happening. But I don't understand, Marcus continued. How am I here? How are we both here? Lyra smiled through her tears. Love, Marcus. Love and magic and the will to keep a promise even death couldn't break. You found a way back to me, just like you said you would. The sound of his name, his real name, the name from that other life, unlocked something inside him. More memories flooded in. Their first meeting in a tavern on a backwater world. Their first kiss under alien stars. The day they had sworn to stand together against the darkness that was consuming the galaxy. And with the memories came understanding. The strange pull that had drawn him across the desert, the certainty that he needed to be here, it all made sense now. He had been reborn, given a new life and a new face, but his soul had remembered its purpose. Lyra, he said, and her name felt like coming home. She was moving toward him now, the chains dragging in the sand behind her. But she wasn't advancing to attack. She was coming to embrace him, to close the distance that had separated them for 2 centuries. I knew you would come back, she whispered as she reached him. I never doubted, not even in the darkest moments. I knew you would keep your promise. Marcus looked into her amber eyes and saw everything he had lost, everything he had fought to reclaim. But he also saw the chains that still bound her, the collar that marked her as a prisoner. Let me free you, he said. Lyra shook her head. The chains are more than metal, my love. They're bound with sorcery, with the king's own power. They can't be broken by conventional means. But Marcus was already moving, his hands closing around the chains that hung from her wrists. The metal was warm under his touch, almost alive with malevolent energy. He could feel the king's power in them, could sense the complex spells that bound them to her flesh. I broke them once before, he said, though he wasn't sure how he knew that. When we first escaped from the Citadel's dungeons. I can break them again. He pulled, putting all his strength into the effort. The chains resisted, the metal biting into his palms and drawing blood. But slowly, incredibly, he felt them beginning to give way. The crowd was on its feet now, roaring with excitement and disbelief. This wasn't how the trial was supposed to go. No one had ever broken the Unchained's bonds before. With a sound like breaking thunder, the chains shattered. Metal fragments rained down on the arena floor, glittering in the morning sunlight like fallen stars. Lyra gasped, staggering as the weight she had carried for 2 centuries suddenly disappeared. You kept your promise, she whispered, raising her hands to stare at her freed wrists in wonder. But their moment of triumph was short-lived. The king was on his feet in his viewing box, his face twisted with rage. The ground beneath the arena began to shake as his power was unleashed. You fool, he roared, his voice carrying over the chaos of the crowd. You've unleashed her. Do you have any idea what you've done? Lyra turned toward the king's box, and Marcus saw something in her expression that made his blood run cold. It wasn't gratitude or relief. It was hunger. A predator's hunger that had been denied satisfaction for far too long. But when she looked back at him, her expression softened. She stepped close and whispered in his ear, "Now we finish it." The words sent a chill down Marcus's spine, but also a thrill of anticipation. He understood now why he had come here, why fate had brought them together again. The king had been their enemy in that other life, the one who had destroyed their sanctuary and separated them for 2 centuries. Now it was time for justice. "What do you need me to do?" he asked. Lyra smiled, and it was a beautiful and terrible thing to see. "What you did before. Fight beside me, trust me. And when the time comes, don't hesitate." She gestured, and weapons flew from the arena wall into their hands. A sword for him, curved and deadly, forged from the same metal as her former chains. For herself, she simply flexed her fingers, and Marcus could see energy crackling between them. "Together?" she asked. "Together," he confirmed. They moved as one, charging toward the king's viewing box. The royal guards tried to intercept them, but they were no match for the fury of 2 lovers reunited after centuries of separation. Marcus's sword cut through armor and flesh with equal ease, while Lyra's unleashed power sent bodies flying like broken dolls. But as they fought their way through the corridors, Marcus noticed something that made his blood run cold. One of the guards he had cut down was wearing familiar armor, the same style he had seen on one of the king's personal attendants, the one who had given him water during his first night in the dungeons. "Wait," he called to Lyra, but she was already ahead of him, her power carving a path of destruction toward the throne room. The king met them in the main corridor leading to his throne room, but he wasn't alone. Behind him stood a figure in familiar armor, Captain Drell, the guard who had shown Marcus small kindnesses during his captivity, who had whispered encouragement before the trial. "Surprised?" Drell said, his voice now cold and mocking. "Did you really think a human could cross the desert without guidance? Without someone ensuring you reach the fortress alive?" Marcus felt the world tilt beneath his feet. You led me here. Every step of the way. The king needed someone who could break her chains, and she," he gestured toward Lyra, "needed someone naive enough to believe her story of lost love." "He's lying," Lyra said, but there was something in her voice, a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. The king smiled his predatory smile. "Am I? Tell me, human, do you know what she is? What she was before I chained her?" "Don't listen to him," Lyra pleaded, moving closer to Marcus. But as she reached for him, as her arms began to encircle him in what should have been a comforting embrace, Drell struck. His energy blade pierced through her back, the glowing tip emerging from her chest in a spray of blue blood. Lyra gasped, her eyes wide with shock and pain. She looked down at the blade protruding from her body, then up at Marcus with an expression of heartbreaking vulnerability. "Marcus," she whispered and collapsed forward into his arms. The world went red around the edges. Marcus felt something break inside him, something that had been barely holding together since he'd first laid eyes on her in chains. The careful control he'd maintained, the rational thought processes that had kept him alive through years of wandering, all of it shattered like glass. "You bastard," he snarled, laying Lyra gently on the floor before turning toward Drell with murder in his eyes. The captain was already pulling his blade free, preparing for another strike. "She was using you, you fool. Everything you felt, everything you remembered. It was all her manipulation." But Marcus was beyond listening to reason. He moved with a fury that surprised even himself, his sword finding the gaps in Drell's armor with surgical precision. The captain tried to bring his weapon to bear, but Marcus was already inside his guard, the ancient blade sliding between his ribs with a wet sound. "You should have taken the offer," Drell gasped as he fell. Marcus didn't even watch him die. He was already turning back to Lyra, kneeling beside her motionless form. Her breathing was shallow, labored, but she was alive. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. What he said, some of it was true. I am what the king claimed. But what I feel for you, that's real. That was always real. "Save your strength," Marcus said, applying pressure to her wound. "We're getting out of here." But even as he spoke, the king was rising behind them, his massive spear crackling with renewed energy. "How touching," the alien monarch said. "But this ends now. The battle that followed was like something out of legend. The king was a formidable opponent, 8 feet of muscle and fury, backed by centuries of experience in the power of dark magic. His spear left trails of destructive energy in its wake, each strike powerful enough to shatter stone. But Marcus fought with the desperate fury of someone who had lost everything and found it again, only to see it threatened once more. The recovered memories of his past life gave him skills he hadn't known he possessed, techniques that had been honed in 100 battles across a dozen worlds. Lyra, wounded but not broken, added her power to his. Together they pressed the attack, driving the king back through his own fortress. But the alien monarch was not easy prey. He fought with the cunning of someone who had ruled for millennia, using the terrain to his advantage, turning their own fury against them. "You think you can defeat me?" he snarled as they faced off in the ruins of his throne room. "I am eternal. I am—" His words were cut off as Lyra's power slammed into him, sending him crashing through a pillar. Marcus was on him before he could recover, his sword seeking the gaps in the alien's armor. But the king was not finished. With a final desperate surge of power, he grabbed Marcus by the throat and lifted him off the ground. "If I cannot have her," he gasped, blood dripping from his lips, "then no one can." The spear point drove toward Marcus's heart, but Lyra was there, her hands glowing with the last of her strength. She placed them on either side of the king's head, and Marcus watched in fascination and horror as the monarch's body convulsed and then went still. The massive alien crashed to his knees, then toppled forward onto the obsidian floor. His crown rolled across the stones, ringing against the walls like a funeral bell. "It's over," Lyra said, but there was no satisfaction in her voice. Only exhaustion and a sadness that spoke of too many years and too much pain. Marcus climbed to his feet, looking down at their fallen enemy. "Is he really dead?" "He's dead," Lyra confirmed. "His power dies with him. The fortress, his army, everything he built, it will all crumble now." She moved toward the king's corpse, kneeling beside the massive form. With one finger, she traced a symbol on his forehead, a complex sigil that seemed to burn itself into the dead flesh before fading to nothing. "What was that?" Marcus asked. "A binding," she said quietly, "to make sure he stays dead. Some powers, they have a way of lingering." She was right about the fortress crumbling. Already Marcus could hear the sound of fighting from elsewhere in the structure, as the king's death released his subjects from their magical bonds of loyalty. The uprising they had started would spread, and by morning the tyrant's empire would be nothing but ruins. Marcus turned to say something to Lyra, to share this moment of victory with her, but found himself facing empty air. She was gone, vanished as silently as smoke. Only the scent of her presence lingered, exotic and alien. But where she had been standing, burned into the obsidian floor, was the same symbol she had traced on the king's forehead. Below it, scratched into the stone as if by fingernails, were words in an ancient script that somehow he could read. The chains were never his. They were always mine. "Lyra?" he called out, but received no answer except the echo of his own voice from the ruined throne room. He searched the corridors, calling her name, but found only bodies in the growing chaos of a fortress tearing itself apart. Slaves were breaking free from their cells, soldiers were deserting their posts, and the carefully maintained order of the king's reign was dissolving into anarchy. As he moved deeper into the fortress's lower levels, following the sound of distant voices, Marcus heard something that made his blood run cold, the sound of children crying. He found them in the deepest dungeons, dozens of small figures huddled in cells that had been carved directly from the bedrock. They were from different species, different worlds, but all shared the same look of terror and desperation. Some were mere toddlers, their tiny faces pressed against the iron bars. "The spawning chambers," a voice whispered from behind. But there was something different about her now, a coldness in her amber eyes that hadn't been there before. "What?" Marcus asked. "The king's insurance policy. Children taken from conquered worlds, raised to serve, to fight, to die for his entertainment." She stepped closer, her bare feet making no sound on the stone floor. "I could leave now, Marcus. Walk away from all of this. From you." The children's cries grew louder, more desperate, as if they sensed salvation nearby. "But you won't," Marcus said, though he wasn't entirely certain. Lyra smiled, and it was beautiful and terrible to behold. Number, I want them all to die first, and I want you to watch. Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. Them? The children. No, my love. The guards, the overseers, everyone who kept them caged. Her eyes gleamed with predatory hunger. I want to show you what freedom really looks like. The fortress shook as another section collapsed somewhere above them. Time was running out. The children need to get out of here, Marcus said. The children are not our responsibility. They are now. Lyra studied his face for a long moment, as if seeing something there that surprised her. You would delay our escape? Risk capture? For strangers? Marcus looked at the frightened faces pressed against the bars of their cells, then back at Lyra. Wouldn't you? Something flickered across her expression. Surprise, perhaps, or disappointment. You're not what I expected. Is that good or bad? I haven't decided yet, but she was already moving toward the cells, her power crackling around her fingers as she began to melt the locks. As they worked to free the children, she paused before one particular cage. A small cell that held a girl no more than 7 years old, with pale blue skin and silver hair that reminded Marcus painfully of Lyra herself. Lyra's hand froze on the lock. For a long moment, she just stared at the child, who looked back with eyes that held too much knowledge for someone so young. You shouldn't have come with me, Lyra said without looking at Marcus. No one should have. And you shouldn't have stayed, Marcus replied, guiding another freed child toward the exit. But you did. Lyra's fingers traced the bars of the small cell, her voice distant. I remember screaming from one just like this, but no one came. She looked at the girl again, seeing something of herself in those frightened eyes. No one ever came. The lock melted under her touch, and she lifted the child out with surprising gentleness. Until now, she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. He wandered through the burning corridors of the fortress, stepping over the bodies of fallen guards and the debris of a collapsing empire. The king's crown lay forgotten in a pool of melted gold, its gems scattered like fallen stars across the obsidian floor. Everything the tyrant had built was turning to ash, but Marcus felt no satisfaction in their victory. The twin moons hung overhead when he finally found his way to the main gates. The desert stretched out before him, silver sand dunes rolling away to the horizon like a frozen sea. He had crossed that wasteland to reach this place, driven by a compulsion he hadn't understood. Now he would have to cross it again, this time truly alone. He was about to step out into the night when he heard footsteps behind him. Going somewhere, Marcus spun around, his heart leaping at the sound of her voice. Lyra stood in the shadows of the gateway, barely visible in the moonlight. She looked different somehow, younger, more vital, as if the king's death had lifted a burden from her shoulders that went beyond mere physical chains. I thought you'd left, he said, unable to keep the relief out of his voice. I had to be sure, she replied, stepping closer. I had to be certain that his death would really free me, that there weren't any hidden bindings or delayed curses waiting to spring. And, she smiled, but there was something in her expression that made Marcus suddenly wary. I'm free, completely and utterly free. For the first time in 2 centuries, I have no master, no bonds, no one to serve but myself. That's wonderful, Marcus said, though something in her tone suggested this wasn't entirely good news. Is it? Lyra moved closer, and Marcus noticed that she still carried one piece of her former chains, a length of the cursed metal that had bound her wrists. Tell me, Marcus, what do you remember about the promise you made me all those years ago? I promised to come back for you, to find you no matter what it took. And? Marcus frowned, trying to recall the exact words. I promised to be yours, to belong to you completely. Yes, Lyra said softly, raising the broken chain. You did. Before he could react, she had snapped the metal around his neck with a brutal click. The chain was shorter than the ones that had bound her, but no less secure. Marcus could feel the same malevolent energy he had sensed in her original bonds, could sense the complex sorcery that now linked them on a level that transcended flesh and bone. What? He started to say, but she silenced him with a finger to his lips. 200 years ago, you swore you'd be mine, she said, her voice filled with an affection that was somehow more terrifying than any threat. Now you are. Marcus tried to speak, tried to move, but found that he couldn't. The chain around his neck wasn't just a physical binding, it was something far more profound. It connected them in ways he was only beginning to understand, making him hers in a manner that went beyond any conventional concept of ownership. But instead of dragging him like a prisoner, she stepped beside him and took his hand in hers. Their fingers locked together, and Marcus felt a strange sense of completeness, as if a part of him that had been missing for centuries had finally returned. The chain between them swung gently, glinting in the moonlight. Lyra leaned close, her breath warm against his ear as she spoke words that chilled him to the bone. "You gave me freedom, Marcus. Now I take my price." Her voice was soft, almost loving. "You're mine forever. Even if you die again, you'll still be mine." Marcus felt the weight of those words settle over him like a shroud. There was something in her tone, something ancient and possessive, that spoke of powers he was only beginning to understand. "The chain around your neck," she continued, her fingers tracing the metal with tender precision. "It's not just binding you to me. It's binding your soul. Death won't free you from this, my love. Nothing will." Marcus should have been terrified, should have fought against the binding, should have demanded answers or explanations. But as they began to walk through the burning corridors of the fortress, stepping over the bodies of their enemies, he found that he didn't want to resist. He remembered now, not just the promise he had made to come back for her, but the other promise, the one he had made to be hers, completely and eternally, no matter what the cost. The fortress was burning around them, smoke pouring from the upper levels where the uprising had spread. The king's crown lay forgotten in a pool of melted gold, its gems scattered like fallen stars across the obsidian floor. Through the smoke and chaos, they walked side by side toward the main gates and the desert beyond. They were chained together now, bound by more than metal, their shadows stretching behind them in the firelight like the beginning of a legend. Or perhaps a curse. The twin moons hung overhead, casting their silver light across the endless expanse of sand. Somewhere in the distance, Marcus could hear the sound of ships approaching, the first of many who would come to investigate the fall of the tyrant king. But that was a concern for another day. For now there was only the desert, the stars, and the woman beside him whose love had transcended death itself. They walked into the night together, two souls reunited at last, bound by chains that were stronger than steel, and a love that was more enduring than time itself. Behind them the fortress burned, sending a pillar of smoke and flame up into the alien sky. It would burn for days, they knew, and when the ashes finally cooled, there would be nothing left but ruins and memories. But they would still be walking, still be together, carrying their love and their darkness with them, wherever the roads of the galaxy might lead. Marcus glanced down at the chain that connected them, feeling its weight against his neck. He had no idea if it was a vow or a sentence. But as Lyra's words echoed in his mind, he began to suspect it was something far more permanent than either.